Okay. Good afternoon to everyone. Let me welcome you to our fifth webinar on this series devoted to the study, investigation, questioning of the many sides of screens. This afternoon, I have the privilege to introduce a colleague and a friend, Professor Manos Tsakiris from London. Let me introduce Manos, telling you very shortly about his career. Manos was born in Greece. He studied psychology in Athens, philosophy at King's College in London, and cognitive neuropsychology at University College of London, where he completed his PhD in psychology and cognitive neurosciences at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience in Queen's Square at UCL. In 2007, he joined the Department of Psychology at the Royal Holloway of the University of London, where he is at present professor of psychology. Manos' research is highly interdisciplinary, and as it uses a wide range of methods to investigate the neurocognitive mechanisms that shape the experience of embodiment and self-identity. He is a recipient of many awards and prizes. Let me mention a few: the Young Mind and Brain Prize in 2014, the Experimental Psychology Society Prize in 2015, and the Nomis Foundation Distinguished Scientist Award in 2016. Since 2016, Manos Tsakiris is leading the interdisciplinary Body and Image in Arts and Science, BIAS, project at the Warburg Institute in London, and since 2017, the In the Self ERC Consolidator project at Royal Holloway. And this afternoon, Manos Tsakiris will talk about feeling in seeing is believing, the visceral dimension of visual politics when news are fake. Please, Manos, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vittorio, for the invitation. So let me try and share my screen now. Okay. So you should be able to see my screen, and now you should be able to see my slides, correct? Vittorio, you can see my slides, right? Can I just get a signal from someone?
Yes, we can see.
All right, so I will be talking a little bit about the work we have been doing as part of the BIAS project. And I guess some of you, or most of you, know me from the work we've been doing at my laboratory Holloway on embodiment, trying to understand the mechanisms that underlie body awareness. But today I will be talking about the research we have been doing at the Warburg Institute, which is part of the School of Advanced Study at the University of London, and mainly the Body and Image in Art and Science project. And let me begin by setting out the big question that we set out to ask and hopefully answer as part of the BIAS project. We were interested very much on the power of images, and we wanted to approach this question of how do we bodily relate and respond to other human beings in a culture that it is powered by images. And I hope that during the course of the talk, this question will become clear in the kind of approach we took. And this work was possible because I had this amazing team that has been working with me at different phases of the project. And every single one of them has been involved in the studies that I will be talking about today. Now, let me say a few things about the Warburg Institute. The Institute takes its name from Avi Warburg, who was an art historian, or as he used to call himself, an historian of images. And Warburg himself was very much interested in how ideas and thoughts travel across space and time via images, thinking of images as vehicles that enable the transportation, the transfer of these images. The library, the Institute takes its name because it also houses its library, and it's a very interesting library because it classifies books in a very unique way. And in a sense, Warburg anticipated what we nowadays call interdisciplinary work, because the way in which he classified his books were not according to disciplines, but according to themes. So assuming that you will have, an interest on death or rituals, you would find in his library books from different disciplines that concern the same kind of topic. And there was a vision in Warburg that spoke in favor of this meeting of disciplines rather than staying within one's own disciplinary boundaries. Now, there were, of course, other people associated with the Warburg Institute. Ernst Gombrich was one of the directors for a considerable amount of time. And Gombrich himself was also interested in the possible dialogue between different disciplines. This is one example of his work on art and illusion, trying to bring together psychology and art theory. And in that book, he says something that is quite interesting and something that relates a lot to how we think about perception nowadays. He says that pictures are relational models of reality. Perception is not a given, but a learned practice involving an active construction of the world. And resemblance to reality is an effect generated by the interplay between the expected and the unexpected. And you can see already in this quote that Gombrich was thinking about perception in very similar ways to the ones that we tend to think nowadays in terms of predictive coding, in terms of this active perception of the world, in terms of the interplay between the expected, in other words, the prediction, and the unexpected, in other words, the prediction error. Another important person associated with the Institute, and the reason why I spent a few years doing my research there, is David Friedberg, director of the Italian Academy at the Columbia University in New York, who also served as director of the Warburg for 2 years. Now, David wrote a rather influential book more than 15 years ago on the power of images, trying to put forward a history and a theory of our responses to images. Now, that book, read by a psychologist, makes a lot of sense, but it was quite controversial when it was read by art historians, mainly because Friedberg puts forward the idea that one thing that we have actually ignored when thinking about our responses to images is the power that they have and their emotive nature. And in the book, Friedberg says that when we see an image of the king, to put it in the classical imperial terms, we respond or are inclined to respond as if the king himself were present. This is both theory and reality. The obstacle, he says, is our reluctance to reinstate emotion as part of cognition. Now, as a psychologist, the quote makes complete sense to me, thinking about the importance of emotion in shaping cognition. But from the point of view of art history, maybe that approach seemed a little bit too embodied, a little bit too involved, a little bit against the canon of having this reflective distance perspective on the images that we see. But Friedberg was highlighting something quite important, and of course, in his work with Vittorio, they capitalized on what was the accelerating body of evidence about mirror neurons and mirroring responses to think about what actually happens when you observe implied human movements in all sorts of images. But from my perspective, it also highlights the need to account for what is happening in terms of our physiological engagement with what we see. In other words, the kind of visceral physiological states elicited and their mentalization as affect and emotion. And of course, images have always been considered as very powerful cultural agents, shaping societies, communities, and our understanding of events that may be happening in many different parts of the world. And in the many different forms, from religious icons to paintings, to photography, to video, images have always shaped our understanding of the societies and cultures we live in. And this is just an example to illustrate what is the increasing space that images have been occupying in our culture. This is a video developed by Josh Begley, an artist in Brooklyn, New York, and he took all the front covers of the New York Times, which is a large paper with very, very small fonts. So this is a video of all the covers of the New York Times from 1852 to 2017. And you can see there are very few images appearing every now and then, typically associated with some major events. Now, eventually you have the emergence of photojournalism in the 30s and 40s of the previous century. And you see how much more space images start occupying. And eventually, in the late 70s and 80s, you have this explosion of imagery with the Kodak color film. I think that video illustrates what was happening in traditional media, but it also points to what is happening nowadays in terms of the social media that we're all using. And there are estimates about 1 billion new images uploaded on the internet every single day. And of course, images, photojournalistic images, have had quite substantial political capacity. I'm showing you here some iconic images that marked the 20th century history, and some more recent ones. This is an image that documents the tortures that were happening in Iraqi prisons. And it's quite interesting because for about a year and a half, there were articles written in major US outlets reporting the presence of tortures in Iraqi prisons. But it was only when these images were actually published that you observed a shift in the US public opinion. This is another iconic image from the refugee crisis that documents the death of the 3-year-old Alan Kurdi. And of course, we do know that following the publication of that news story, and most probably of that particular image, we observed a shift both in public opinion, but also in the policy of the European Commission towards a refugee crisis. And this is an image that has come to our attention 2 summers ago when Trump very controversially ordered the separation between children and their parents when they were crossing illegally into the United States. So at the Bias Project, we wanted to try and think a little bit more about this relation to this kind of photojournalistic images, try to understand, for example, why and how such images may elicit empathic responses, whereas for others, they may not elicit this kind of responses. This is an infamous sort of journalist, one could say, Katie Hopkins, who used to work for The Sun, who says, "No, I don't care. Show me pictures of coffins, show me bodies floating in water, play violence and show me skinny people looking sad. I still don't care." So these kind of images are quite strong and powerful. And I think Rilke's quote here goes at the heart of the matter, where he writes that the work of the eyes is done, and go now and do the hard work on the images imprisoned within you. And the important thing here is that understanding this power of images may require us to go beyond visual perception and think more deeply about the kind of physiological engagement, reaction, visceral responses that these images elicit in us. So with this kind of insights, we brought together ideas from different disciplines, and we set up a lab inside the Warburg Institute in November 2016. And we were ready to start a series of psychophysiological experiments, trying to understand the power of images and our physiological engagement with them. And we were very excited because we thought that we were actually following on Avi Warburg's vision about this need for interdisciplinary work. So that was November 2016, and very soon after that, this is what happened. Trump was inaugurated as the 45th president of the United States in January 2017. And 2 days later, this is what happened. The very concept of alternative facts was introduced in our language. I must say that this concept was introduced in relation to images, because the whole debate that led to the introduction of the term alternative facts had to do with which inauguration, the Trump or the Obama inauguration, had the largest crowds. And of course, the whole world was able to see the crowds in the Trump inauguration, which you can see here on specimen A. And nevertheless, the Trump administration itself, Sean Spicer, the then press secretary of the Trump, said, the Trump inauguration attracted the largest crowds in the history of presidential inaugurations. The next morning, Ellen Conway, one of the advisors, went on CNN and said, there are alternative facts, and we were right in saying that there are more people in this photo on A than this photo on B. And if you ask Trump supporters, as these psychologists and journalists did from Washington Post, you will see that Trump supporters, they got it quite wrong. They thought that the image from the Trump inauguration displayed largest crowds, or they also thought that it was image B that was depicting the Trump inauguration. But of course, these guys, the Trump supporters, may be just having some kind of expressive responding, giving to the journalists the kind of answers they were expecting. Now, soon after that, the Time magazine, on its cover, I was wondering whether the truth was dead. And a few months later, scientists from many different disciplines started thinking that maybe we do need a rather rigorous multidisciplinary approach to understand fake news, how they are created, how are they communicated, how are they transmitted in social networks, what kind of responses they elicit, and what may be the behavioral consequences. So in this kind of framework, historical, cultural context where we found ourselves when we're developing the bias project, our question took a rather different direction, because now we could start thinking about response to these images, where if I were to ask you, what do you see in that image, it's quite likely that you would say that you see a boy, probably this boy is a refugee, and it seems that the boy is sleeping next to what I would say looks like the graves, maybe the graves of his parents. But then you look at the image like that, and then you start wondering, and you may say, well, maybe that image is not real. Maybe the image on the left was actually staged. Maybe it is fake. It doesn't really represent a real life situation. In other words, the child sleeping next to his parents' graves. And the kind of context I'm describing also made us go back and read things that we have been reading when we were at a university. And this is Hannah Arendt from The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she says that the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, in other words, the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, in other words, the standards of thought, no longer exist. So thinking about the kind of images we're consuming, how these images are generated, how are they contextualized, what kind of feelings they elicit in us, how these feelings compare to the reality of our experience, seem to be framing our bias question in rather different ways. Now, of course, the question of what is real and what is fake in imagery has a very long history. Of course, in art history, thinking about forged paintings, but also in photography. This is one of the most famous anti-war images, an iconic image by Robert Capa, taken during the Spanish Civil War, The Falling Soldier. But even that image is debated whether it is actually real, authentic, depicting something as it happened when it happened, or whether it is a staged image. Here you can see three images. Two of those images are actually real. One is manipulated. I'm not going to tell you which one is manipulated. I will let you guess. And of course, the question is, how do we solve this question? How can we detect whether an image is real or fake? Framing matters, although it may not be accurate in the kind of influence it may have. So if you see something in a news source that you trust, it's more likely that you will believe that this image is real, as opposed to seeing the image in a website or a news outlet that you do not trust. Expertise matters. So if you're a photojournalist, if you're a photo editor, if you're a photographer, you would be able to spot very fast which of these three images has been manipulated. And nowadays we also have photo forensics, so we can computationally try and detect whether images have been manipulated. Contextual effects are of course quite important. This is a study done by David Friedberg together with Ulrich Kirk, where they showed to two groups of participants the same images from the IAPS database, and they gave them different instructions. So one group was instructed that they're looking at images that were taken by artwork, and the other group was informed that they were looking at images that were taken from a documentary, trying to convey the idea that, you know, if the image is taken from a documentary, it's likely that it actually documents a real life event, whereas if it's taken from artwork, it may be the product of this artistic creative process. They asked the participants how frightening they found these pictures, and they looked at the bold response. So which brain areas were activated when people were looking at the same images, but under different conditions, thinking that they come from a documentary or thinking that they come from artwork. And you find the expected contextual framing. In other words, when you think that images come from artwork, you find these attenuated responses in the amygdala and the limbic parts of the brain that seem to be responsible for affective emotional responses. But the kind of questions we wanted to ask as part of the bias project was slightly different. The question was what happens, not when there is this kind of context where somebody tells you what you're going to see and the origins of that image, but what happens when you open up your browser in the morning and you buy your newspaper and you see this image, and this image is eliciting a kind of physiological response that is probably much faster than your cognitive judgment. And the question is what happens in terms of this bodily responses that this image elicits in us, and how this influence the kind of judgments we make about the realness of what we're seeing, whether it actually depicts a real life event. So we designed a series of studies, and we started by doing some online pilot studies. First of all, we collected 80 images, all of which were displaying negative aversive human conditions. To the best of our knowledge, these images were taken by established photojournalists associated with established photo agencies. And I'm going to walk you through the kind of experiment we did. This is just some examples of the kind of images we used, and you can appreciate the aversive nature of the stimuli. So when we started the online experiments and people signed up to do our experiment, they only got one piece of information about what they were expected to do. We told them you're going to see a series of photos, and we ask you to rate for each photo how intense is the feeling that the photo elicits in you, how aroused you were, how intense was the feeling. So people will see each image for 4 seconds, and then they have to tell us how arousing it was, using this scale from low arousal to high arousal. And they do that for all these 80 images that we have. And at the end of this, they think, our participants think that the experiment is over. But we tell them, no, it's not over. Now we want you to take part in the second part of our experiment. And if you agree, we're going to show you again the same images in a new random order. And this time we want you to tell us whether you think that the image is real or fake. And we give them a definition, a working definition of what we mean by real, that images were taken during a real life event. In other words, they capture the event as it happened, when it happened, and that was not staged in any way. And the emotions and actions shown are genuine. Whereas fake pictures show a staged event or manipulated pictures that have altered the nature or the content of the event. So again, they will see each image for 4 seconds, and they have to tell us whether they think this image is real or fake, and how confident they are in their judgments. So What I'm going to show you now is the arousal levels for each picture that we used across 3 experiments, and I'm ranking them from low arousal to high arousal. So you can see, this image here is rather low in arousal, this image is very high in arousal. These are the data from the first part of the experiment. In the next slide, I'm going to replace the blue bars with red asterisks, and you're going to see many, 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 many blue dots. The blue dots represent individual judgments from individual participants. The red asterisks represent the average arousal levels. And what you can appreciate is that there's a lot of variance. So for every given photograph, some people thought that it's very low in arousal, whereas some others thought that it's very high in arousal. So far, so good. So then our main interest was to try and see what happens in terms of people's judgments as they were given to us in the second part of the experiment. So we computed what we call a probability score, which is the combination of people's judgment, whether they thought that the image was real or fake, and how confident they are in their judgment. And what I'm plotting here is the probability score for each one of the 8 images we use, and everything above this dotted red line suggests that the image and all these images were more likely to be perceived as real than fake, more probable. Now, of course, our interest here is what, if any, is the relationship between the arousal that people report in the first part of the experiment and the judgments they made about the realness of the images in the second part of the experiment. And what we found was the significant correlation. The arousal levels that people experienced during the first part of the experiment predicted the kind of judgments they made. So the more arousal people experience for a given image in part 1, the more likely they are to say in part 2 that this image is real. We've also looked at some more interesting effects. As I said, arousal was a significant predictor. Age showed this interesting negative correlation. So younger people were more likely to judge photos as real. But we also found an effect of alexithymia, which, as you may know, alexithymia is a subclinical inability to identify or describe emotions. And the more alexithymic the participants were, the less likely they were to judge the photos as being real. In other words, people with a greater inability to identify or describe their emotions, they were more likely to perceive this image of human suffering as being fake or staged. We didn't find any effect of political orientation. And I want to come back to the issue of age because that was quite interesting. Our participants ranged from 21 to 79 years old. And it was interesting to note that even though young people were more likely to judge this image as real, they also reported less arousal. And in fact, the correlation coefficients between arousal and probability were different depending on your age. In other words, the relationship between arousal, your subjective reported arousal, and your probability of judging an image as real was stronger for the older participants. In other words, this may reflect, and this is just a hypothesis that we need to test further, a difference between how digital native and digital immigrant people may be engaging with this kind of images. The fact that young people are more likely to judge photos as real, but they also report less arousal, and they don't show this expected relation between arousal and their judgments, could point to the fact that digital native people, the younger participants, may be engaging in these different ways with this violent imagery without using so much their subjective levels of arousal. Or it could be that different age groups may have different emotion regulation capabilities, and this may be influencing this relationship. Now, having done these studies where they only relied on subjective reports, we thought that it was about time to validate our paradigm in the lab using psychophysiological measures. So first we did a study where we looked at what is the role of changes in heart rate when people are looking at these images. And the structure of the experiment was exactly the same. People come in the lab, the only information they get at the beginning of the experiment is that we're going to show you some photos and we want to record your skin conductance and your heart rate. They know nothing about the second question that we will ask them later on. But once they finish that first part of the experiment, then we give them again the instruction. Now we have a second part. If you want to take part, we're going to show you the images. You have to tell us whether you think they're real or fake. And we replicate what we found in terms of subjective arousal, this time with physiological engagement, where higher heart rate acceleration was associated with a greater probability of judging these images as real in the second part of the experiment. And then we decided to move from peripheral signals to central signals, and we focused on the heartbeat evoked potential. In other words, an evoked potential that reflects the cortical processing of cardiac afferent activity. So again, we presented people with the images and we didn't ask them to make any judgment. We just recorded the heartbeat evoked responses when they were seeing these images. Then they make the judgment about the realness or fakeness of the images in the second part of the experiment. And as you can see here, even at the level of the heartbeat evoked potential, we can distinguish between images that people would then go and classify as real, images with a higher probability of being classified as real versus a lower probability. And a larger heartbeat evoked potential amplitude was related with a higher probability of judging the images as being real. Finally, this is the last experiment that I will describe, is we thought of trying to get another more implicit measure of what we were getting at, which is this link between your physiological but also subjective response to the emotive nature of the images and your judgments. So we designed an experiment where in the first part, as before, we showed people these images and we asked them to tell us how arousing they find every image. And then we changed a little bit the second part of the experiment. So now we told them, we're going to show you again the same images and we're going to give you a label because these images have been fact-checked by a fact-checking agency and they can determine whether the image was real or fake, whether it was real or manipulated and staged. And when you see this label, we want you to tell us how surprised you are by this label, by the fact that a given image was labeled as real or fake. And what we were interested in is seeing here if there is this interaction between the arousal levels that people were reporting in the first part of the experiment and the surprise that they reported in the second part of the experiment. And indeed, what we found was precisely that participants indicated greater surprise for the labeling of a picture when they had previously reported a high arousal for that picture, and that picture was labeled as fake in the second part of the experiment. And this was a nice way of illustrating with this implicit measure the presence of this strong link between arousal and the kind of judgments that people are making about the visual material they're exposed to. Lastly, we looked in the kind of emotional signature that these images elicit, because on purpose we engage with images that are quite complex. They represent quite well the kind of imagery that we see in our everyday life, in the media that we are consuming. So we did another experiment where we tried to understand what is the emotional signature on each of these images that we have, and whether there are specific patterns of emotion, specific emotional signatures that may influence people's judgments about the realness of these images. So that was another study with a new set of participants, where for every image that we showed them, we asked them to select from a range of emotions and tell us how strongly they experienced that particular emotion. So for example, they would see that image, and you can see here that people experienced intense sadness, fear, they didn't experience pleasure or joy, lower levels of anger. This is another image where people experience intense fear and sadness. And doing that for all the images that we had gave us a quite rich data set that was analyzed with great proficiency by Raffaele Ticciarelli, where he tried to say whether there are some kind of components in the kind of material that we used. He did a hierarchical clustering analysis that reveals two main clusters. One of images that we call them suffering images relating to human suffering, and one big cluster that relates to violence. And we identified these five main components. The first one was anger, compassion, where the largest positive loading was compassion and the largest negative loading was anger. And this image also had other loadings, positive for tenderness and sadness, and negative for disgust, fear, excitement, and pleasure. The second component was negative positive, with positive values of joy, pleasure, excitement, and hope, and negative values of disgust, anger, and sadness, fear, shame, hope and pain, and guilt and hope. And then we tried to say whether the specific emotional signatures were more or less likely to correlate with the judgments of realness that people made. Here you can see the classification, the pictures organized based on the principal component analysis for component 1, which is anger, compassion, and component 2, which is guilt and hope. And for images that, you know, were falling in this class of violence, people would report strong emotions of fear, disgust, and anger, but lower tenderness, compassion, and sadness. And for these images of human suffering, you would find increased tenderness, compassion, and sadness, and reduced fear, disgust, and anger. And asking the question whether specific types of emotions influence the kind of subjective judgments, we did find that anger and compassion and guilt and hope were the strongest ones, and especially for images for which participants reported greater compassion and positive feelings associated with this dimension, people were more likely to judge these images as real. That in itself has quite interesting consequences for how we understand the photojournalistic and video documentation of socio-political events. And you can think that a lot of the coverage relates either to disasters that affect a great number of people or to clashes between social groups. And how these clashes between social groups and the violence depicted in the media that you consume may influence people's judgments and the possible consequences that this may have on how audiences engage with what is happening is a quite interesting approach that we would like to explore further. So, just to bring you up, to bring together the findings and point a little bit to the implications in the future, what we have been trying to see is what is the role that our physiology plays in engaging us with reality and imagery beyond or even before our cognitive processing. And our findings suggest that feeling in sync seems to be a quite strong signal that at least partly to some extent determines, shapes our beliefs in the realness of a culture powered by images. Now, there are interesting smaller findings that we want to follow up, such as the question of age differences, whether people of different ages, people who may be digital natives or immigrants may be responding differently to the imagery of human suffering, the role of alexithymia, and the role of political orientation. In all these experiments that I showed you, we didn't find any effects of political orientation. In other words, whether people were conservative or liberal in their political attitudes didn't play a role. The only experiment where it did play a role is when we framed the question of real, fake differently. So we did another study that I didn't show you, where it had the same structure. In part 1, people just have to give ratings, their arousal. And when they finish that, we tell them, now we're going to show you the same image again. And we want you to tell us whether you think that these images are taken from a documentary or from an artwork. In other words, whether they are taken by something that documented real life events, or whether they are the product of artistic creation. And it was only that experiment that politically conservative people were more likely to tell us that the images were taken from artwork rather than documentary. But I think that, the approach that we're putting forward is amenable to understanding a little bit more the cultural and historical factors that may be shaping our embodied engagement. And I think that this is quite important when we want to go beyond what has often been an unhistorical neuroscientific approach to emotions and empathy. But in a sense, one could ask, what do we actually show? And when I presented this work in one lab seminar, Patrick Haggard, who was attending, he said, "That all sounds great. It reminds me of good old existentialism. Physiological engagement is a pretty strong index to the realness of our existence and the realness of the world." And in fact, what we do show is that this physiological engagement, not only when it comes to the experience of one's own self, but also when it comes to the experience of the world and the kind of materiality or imagery of the world that we're exposed to, may be a strong signal that determines our beliefs to their realness. And of course, that relates to our current understanding of the importance that interoceptive signals, in other words, the signals from your visceral organs that are being mentalized and shape the context within which cognition takes place, may be important not only for our sense of presence in the world, but also for self-awareness and more broadly for how we perceive our interactions, our relation with the world, including these visual depictions of the world we inhabit. I also want to link the work we've been doing with other attempts to understand how people may be responding to different types of information. In that sense, in that example here, textual and on Twitter. And I think it's nice, the study, because it resonates with our findings. That was a mega study that looked at a huge amount of data, a huge amount of tweets that have been tweeted. And the authors identified a subset of stories that were fact-checked for being real and stories that were fact-checked for being fake. And then they tracked the journey of these tweets and stories. And what they found was that false news reached more people than true news. The top 1% of false news cascades diffused between 1,000 and 100,000 people, whereas true stories rarely diffused more than 1,000 people. False news also diffused faster than the truth. And they identified two important factors that explain this pattern: the degree of novelty and the emotional reactions of the recipients. What they mean by degree of novelty is how novel, unexpected, like a prediction error, was the fake tweet that you received in relation to the history of the tweets you have been receiving over the last days. And if it was rather novel, if it was more unexpected, you're more likely to actually retweet it, and then it will diffuse further and faster. And emotional reactions, especially surprise and disgust, seem to suggest that they drive this pattern of retweeting falsehoods faster and further. And I think these findings resonate with what we've been trying to say, both in terms of the unexpected, the prediction error, the kind of physiological response elicited by the kind of things you're consuming. Now, it is an unknown question whether the unexpected, the novel, coupled with a strong emotive response, makes it more likely for you to believe that it is real, and then you try to communicate it further and faster. But we don't have any access to the intentions of the people who actually retweeted these false stories. We don't know whether they retweeted them because they thought that they were real, or whether because they were so incredibly unbelievable fake, and they just wanted to share that with their followers. But I think it is clear that, and I'm sure that, you know, similar kind of issues have been discussed in the seminars that Vittorio has been holding, that we are living at a time where our relation to what is true or fake, or what is real or not real, is radically changing. Traditionally, we know that humans default to truth. I want to believe what you're telling me, and you want to do the same. And communication of truthful information is at the base of a lot of the successes of humankind. Now, one worry or concern is what happens when the default state is not that the information that is being communicated is truthful, but the default state within which we operate is that everything can be faked, or everything can be unreal, deep faked. And what then? So what if the default is that truth has died and potentially everything that we are exposed to is artificially constructed, manipulated, faked, and so on? And it's not just the information, but it's also the agents who may be disseminating information that may start to be unreal, fake. And what I'm showing you here is examples of gun faces. So these are faces generated by generative adversarial networks. So these are faces of people who never existed and they will never exist. Nevertheless, they can be used for many different purposes. They can, of course, be used in marketing and advertising, but they can also be used for political propaganda and espionage. This is one example of somebody, Katie Jones, with that face, and that's the face of somebody who never existed. Nevertheless, Katie Jones managed to build this LinkedIn profile, and then she got in touch and connections with people who have been working in the US administration. She was eventually revealed as being a spy who used AI-generated face to connect with targets. And there are many different examples of people with fake profiles who may be very active bots on social media. And of course, we have deepfake videos where with a few button presses, you can more or less create whatever you want in terms of artificial videos. So there are two worries. One, is about the content, and the other is about the agents who disseminate the visual material. Now, this question about the role of photography has a long history. People have been thinking that photography of human suffering may be rendering audiences apathetic or indifferent. But nevertheless, images continue to be powerful political agents and have strong performative power. And I think in a culture that it is powered by images, we should be hoping for greater image literacy on behalf of the audiences. We should not underestimate the emotive nature of images and the kind of responses that they elicit, and make people a bit more smarter rather than just relying on algorithms. Now, the line of work that I've been describing resonates with parallel epistemological turns in a range of disciplines. I'm thinking about visual global politics. This is an excellent edited book by Roland Blaker, thinking about how images shape our understanding of socio-political events in many different places of the world. Thinking about the democratization of photography, the fact that any one of us can become a photojournalist. Thinking about the seductive belief that what we see in a photograph or a video in images is an authentic representation of the world, and what are the consequences of that. And that cannot be dissociated from the kind of physiological and affective responses that the images are eliciting in us. But also there's a parallel epistemological turn towards emotion in history as a discipline. I'm thinking about this excellent book by Rob Bottis on emotions understood not just as consequences, but as active causes of historical events, and understanding the centrality of emotions is important for understanding how our socio-political history unfolds. And of course, the social affective term in neuroscience. And I think it's not coincidence that the very term social neuroscience was coined by the late John Cacioppo and Gary Bergson, who were also the ones who actually edited the seminal handbook of psychophysiology, where they describe not only the methods, the basic methods of psychophysiological measurements, but also the importance of these measures for understanding our social engagement with the world. And finally, we do live in these emotional climates, and whether one calls our time the time of fear or anger or anxiety, the truth is that there are many nervous states that we experience, and that happens both at the level of the citizens and the policymakers and politicians alike. And I think that calls for a more multidisciplinary perspective on the kind of emotions elicited in different socio-political contexts, and how these are both drivers of political behavior, but also targets of political behavior. And I think, again, I would like to relate this work on how we may be thinking about the social construction of emotions, how prescriptions of different affective labels from different sources, whether it is political groups or social groups or political leaders who may be telling to the people what they feel or what they should be feeling given threat X, Y, Z, but also the potential danger of AI and what people who work in what is now called affective computing suggest that they can do on our behalf. In other words, they claim that they can decode our physiological responses and tell us what we feel independently of what we think we actually feel. So it's a very complex web of a range of factors that come into play that have to do with the human condition and the basic neurophysiological mechanisms that are probably universal and enable us to experience emotions, and the role that these visceral signals have in shaping all our cognitive processes, but also the more broader social, political, technological, informational ecosystem we find ourselves in that may be putting emotions at the heart of our engagement with other people, whether these are physically present and we're interacting, or only digitally present, like you are, and I cannot see your reactions while I'm talking. So a question for all of us to consider for the next few years, certainly one that concerns me a lot, is what does it mean to be a political animal? And the way in which I use the word animal here is understanding that we do have this wet, visceral body that we share to a large extent with other relatives in the animal kingdom, but also the very unique social organization that we have that is there to take care of us to a very large extent. So what does it mean to be a political animal in the 21st century of democratic politics, alternative facts, social media, precarious health, and populism? And some ideas along those lines were presented in an essay I wrote for the Year magazine that was published in a few months ago. I think it was September. And with that, let me thank all the wonderful people who've been working with me in this project. Some people directly, some people have influenced a lot the way I think about these topics, such as Marcello, with whom we've collaborated in the past, and I was very glad to see him here. and my founders, and especially Manos Foundation, that has been funding the bias project. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manos, for this thought-provoking synthesis of many interesting aspects linking viscerality, interoception, more broadly affect and emotion to our sense of what we think to be real and our relation to politics. Now I would like to invite people in the audience to ask questions. Either raise your hand or type it in the Q&A chat. Okay, Paolo Ossola, thanks for the talk. I have two questions. First, did you collect a measure of depression and anxiety? Second, did you find an effect of time over the experiment? I asked whether people show an arousal flattening after several negative valence images.
Yes, thank you, Paolo. No, we didn't collect any measures of depression or anxiety. And I would be interested to see what your prediction would be about that. With regards to the second question, if I remember correctly, in one of the experiments that we did, we didn't find any effect over the course of the experiment. In other words, there was no flattening of the skin conductant response. And in another one, we did find an effect. But in a way, we can control for that by including these effects in our mixed models.
Okay, thank you. I see Marcello Costantini raised his hand, so please, Marcello, come forward.
Thank you, Manos.
Hi,
thank you, Manos. Very interesting. It has been a pleasure for me too to collaborate. Okay. So I have a question. We are mostly visual animals. So do you think that the relationship you find between interoceptive signals and the modality in which you presented the stimuli, visual pictures, is because we are visual animals, or would you expect the same results if you were presenting stimuli in a different sensory modalities? We can judge reality also in the auditory domain, for instance. So do you think that the relationship is preferential between interoceptive signal and vision, or you would expect something similar with other modalities? Thank you.
I think it's a very good question. I would say that I would expect a similar relationship with other modalities. I guess the claim is broader, that you have these constant spontaneous fluctuations in your visceral organs, that they do shape, well, they inform the brain about the context, the physiological context within which any cognition takes place, whether it is visual perception or auditory perception. Now, so that's my general statement. I think if we were to do a study where we would try to think, for example, whether we could have similar kind of effects on auditory tracts that may be, let's think, asking people whether they think that the laughter they were listening is genuine or faked, or the crying. I would think that, again, it's quite likely that we would find the same relationship. But as you say, it's something, we are visual. I mean, the visual phenomenology is much richer than the phenomenology of auditory stimuli, at least the ones that you hear for most of your day. I'm not talking about, a symphony by Beethoven or Mozart, which is of course very rich in the phenomenology. And there are lots of saying about, how we tend to believe in what we see over what we feel in terms of touch or in terms of what we hear. So vision may be more heavily weighted, especially in our culture. So the effects would be they would be accentuated for visual stimuli. Does it answer?
Okay, thank you. More questions?
There is one from Martina.
All right.
And there
Thanks
is
for the
one.
great talk. Do you think participants' judgment about how real fake images are would relate to conspiracy thinking?
So I guess the argument would be that those who are more prone to conspiracy theories, they would also be more prone to say that the images are fake. And I guess that's probably a sensible prediction to make. Although it is interesting because the people who believe that a lot of the things are conspiracies, they also believe in something else. So they do have beliefs, but they have beliefs in something which is alternative from what most people actually believe in. So you would expect that, you know, for certain kind of information or images that are aligned with their beliefs, they wouldn't show this effect. I think that would be my prediction.
Other questions?
Just to say one more thing, because it's quite interesting, and we had a discussion with Vittorio and another group where we meet and we informally discuss. There were people in the United States that while they were dying from COVID inside the hospital, they were still saying to the nurses that they still believed that, you know, COVID is a hoax, that COVID does not really exist. And that makes me wonder about the extent to which the bodily experience, and I'm talking more broadly now about the bodily experience of vulnerability, of illness, of, you know, death is dissociated, completely dissociated by the people's cognitive beliefs about what goes on. I was just recalling that, and I found it relevant to what you were asking. That the realness of their experience, what Hannah Arendt was saying, you know, they couldn't actually use the realness of their experience to change the standards of thought.
I think we have a question from Francesco Casetti. Please, Francesco, come forward.
Thank you, Manos. I have a lot of questions. I'm interested. I'm an old professor interested in images from the point of view of semiotics and media theory. So the first question is, do you have any evidence about the relationship between the judgment of your subject and some recurring features in the images? I mean, formal features. For example, depth of focus, a close-up, these kind of things. This is the first question. And the second question, from the point of view of a media theorist, I would like to know a little more about the setting in which your subject were located. Mm-hmm. Because of course, if it was a laboratory, was one thing. It was a coffee house, it was another thing. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesco. So for your first question, I don't have this kind of formal analysis, but I would be grateful if you knew someone who could help. I mean, this is a set of 8 images, so it's not a huge data set. But as far as I know, you know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's not like a manual by which you can iconographically classify these images. But you know, obviously,
I would be happy if we stay in touch.
Okay, perfect. I'm sure there's some dimensions that one could explore. So for your second question, you're absolutely right. So some of the studies that we did were done online with different participants at different time points. Some of the studies were done in the lab, so we do have a control over the conditions. We do not have a control over the conditions at which people did the experiments online, apart from the fact that they were not able to do the studies on their mobile phone. So they had to use a computer or a laptop. That doesn't mean that they were not in a coffee shop. They may as well have been in a coffee shop, but at least they were not walking with their mobile phone in their hands. Now, to the extent that the results from the online studies and the lab-based studies are consistent, I think this is good news for us. And the other thing is that I do appreciate the need for controlled conditions, but at the same time, I believe that the ecological validity of something that may happen out in the wild, in the places where people are typically consuming images like this, which could be their home, or a coffee shop where they work for, it's okay by me.
I think we have a question from Priscilla. Please come forward.
Hi, Manos. Thank you so much for your presentation. My first question is whether you discovered any sex differences between how men responded emotionally and how women responded, if there was anything statistically significant. And the second question is, besides heart rate and the skin conductance test, were there any other measures physiologically?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to see if I remember correctly, there were no gender differences. Let me see if I can quickly look at least for one of the studies. The second question about the skin conductance and the heart rate, the only effect that we found was about the heart rate acceleration. There was no effect of skin conductance on our experiment that we did in the lab. So it was a heart acceleration, then it was a heartbeat evoked potential in the other one. And just to look quickly for the gender thing, no, there was no significant difference.
Great. I was just curious because, sometimes you hear from studies that, women tend to feel more negative emotions, experience more negative emotions, or at least report it. So I was just, wondering. Thank you.
Welcome.
We have a question from Mark Hansen. Please, Mark, come forward.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Manos, for this very stimulating survey of how images work in the emotional register. I was very taken by the turn at the end of your talk to talk about synthesized images, GAN-produced images, and deep fakes, and what you mentioned at the very end about affective computing and the idea of decoding the physiology of these images. So you've talked mostly about images that are already made and how people respond to them. And I'm interested in the coupling between that dimension of images, but then also how images are actually engineered to produce certain kinds of effects. So I guess I would be curious to hear you say more about what's involved in the decoding of the physiological mechanisms for images and how those can be built into images, whether they're static images or moving images like deep fakes, in order to manipulate the emotional responses of the viewers. And I guess I'm wondering if there's something like, some mechanism like the way mirror neurons works with physical movement, to simulate a kind of bodied state that would, in a certain sense, synthesize that in the image itself. Does that make sense?
It does, and thank you very much for your question. So I can give you two interesting clues. The first one is that the work on photoforensics and the computational, if you like, detection of image manipulation, and I'm thinking mainly about the work of Farid here, has been extended to deepfakes, and it's quite more challenging to determine whether a video is manipulated in that way rather than an image, probably. But what they're looking at is whether, for example, you would expect to find in a deepfake video the small changes in the skin coloration, for example, that correlate with changes in heart rate, well, basically with heartbeats. Because every time that your heart beats, your skin color changes because of the blood vessels dilating. Now, this is not necessarily something that you can see with the naked eye, but computationally you can do it, and in fact you can remotely record someone's heart rate. So using the video cam, I can send you now software and you can actually try to measure my heart rate while I'm talking. Now, this is one clue. The other is the following. Alex Galvez-Paul, together with James Kilner, did some studies where they showed to people videos of two actors sitting next to each other. And, these are two people sitting, looking straight ahead in the camera. And Alex asked the participants to tell him which of the two was more anxious, or which one had the highest heart rate. And people seem to be able to do that above chance levels. So even though we may not consciously be able to perceive these changes that happen on our faces on every single heartbeat, there may be some kind of unconscious processing that goes on that we may use as clues about the physiological state of the other. I think these are exciting directions that come from different sides. So, if you want to construct a really good deepfake video that you want it to be believable to others, you may as well try to get the physiological parameters right, but also thinking about how much we may be able to process unconsciously, non-consciously, on the basis of these subtle physiological signals. I think more exciting work is coming our way from these different dimensions. Does it make sense?
Yeah. No, that's very helpful. Yeah, thank you. What was the name? I'm sorry. What was the name of the last study that you mentioned, or the researchers?
I'm gonna put it here to everyone. So it's Alex Galvez-Paul, and if you email me or if you send me something on Twitter, I think they also have a preprint that you can look for.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so we have a written question, and then I see Marcello raised his hands again. So first, Erica, thank you for the research and talk. It's interesting that you mentioned the changing cultural presence of the quantity of images over time. In the New York Times example, for instance, how do you think our contemporary status of surplus images versus historical scarcity of images affects individual responses to individual images in these very controlled experiments which are conducted in one moment in historical time?
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I mean, two comments. First of all, in our experiment, I think the criticism is not that we present one image at a time, but we present too many images within a short period of time. Although I suspect that probably, seeing 80 images within 30 minutes is probably comparable to what happens when you scroll, when one scrolls the Facebook or Twitter feed. I think the historical moment in time is very interesting, and I would like to do more work on that. Unfortunately, this line of research couldn't take into account the historical context. And you have to be very, very fast and ready to take the risks if you want to study historical context. Because there are two ways to do it. One is to look at images of the past and how people respond to these images now. And for example, we have done a series of studies looking at how people respond to images of the refugee crisis, which they are of the present times, but you can also think of showing to people images of refugees taken 40 or 60 years ago, different periods of time, and see how they respond. And that's interesting. But something which is even more interesting is to see, for example, how people respond to images of the COVID pandemic while we are in the pandemic, and then use the same people 2 or 3 or 4 years later and show them again the same kind of image from the COVID pandemic and try to see whether and how their affective responses or the cognitive judgments and evaluations they make are changing. I think there is scope for much more work to be done. This kind of studies that may have the historical dimension are hugely important, and also it will be hugely important if more colleagues of mine and reviewers would be happy with the idea that we should start using more complex images like the ones that we use that come from, photo agencies, that are the kind of things we consume in our everyday life. So I hope that there will be more work on that.
Marcello.
Yes, thank you, Vittorio. So I have a question regarding the EEG study.
Mm-hmm.
The judgment of the images was predicted by arousal in the online studies. And then in the EEG study, you showed a modulation of the heartbeat evoked potential based on the content of the image. Can you rule out that the modulation of the heartbeat potential is not due to general state of arousal, but the proper judgment of the image? Thank you.
Okay, so I see what you mean. So just because I went really slow through that experiment, again, it had this structure where in the first part, they just passively see the images, and they saw each image, I think, 2 or 3 times, because we wanted to have several heartbeat evoked responses, right? And then they finished the first part, and then the second part where they give the judgments.
Okay.
So it's not a question of the image per se, but of people's heartbeat evoked responses to the images that predicts the probability of judging the images as real or fake, in exactly the same way as you had it with the subjective arousal or the heart acceleration.
Okay.
So what you were saying, if I understood correctly, is that it is the content of the image.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
The content of the image alone. It's the image perceived by somebody.
Yeah. Okay.
It's heartbeat evoked potential, its amplitude will determine.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I will take a chance to make you a couple of questions. The first one focus on interoception, the role of interoception in these matters, the way we react to images, the relationship between our interoceptive responses and our explicit judgment of for an image to be real or fake, etc. The first question deals with the personal profile of the individuals. Namely, to which extent the baseline level of heart rate variability, the baseline levels of respiratory sinus arrhythmia relate to the response that you are obtaining in your cohort. Of course, you can establish that only for those that underwent the lab version of the experiment. And then a more general question asking you, what do you make of a growing feeling of uneasiness with a very rigid and dichotomic view in social matters of the autonomic responses, namely the vagal brake makes you prosocial, the activation of the orthosympathetic system, on the other hand, prepares you for fight or flight. There are attempts to see whether a co-activation profile of responses would enable us to make a clearer sense of some sets of data that, so to speak, are hardly reconcilable with this dichotomic account of autonomic responses. What is your opinion?
I think for the first question, we don't have, I don't think we have heart rate variability data to see whether there is an effect of that. But given that at the group level, we do find this relationship between the physiological response and the judgments, I think that's fine, and it's probably better. Whether there are more nuanced responses depending on individual differences, such as heart rate variability or sinus arrhythmia, possibly. There are no effects of interoceptive accuracy measures, because I think we did measure that and we didn't find an effect. So in a sense, it's probably better if you show that the effect is present independently of individual differences. But of course, individual differences may refine the approach. And also that relates to your second point. And I think, dichotomies are always a bad idea, but I think it is part of the epistemological process itself. Quite often we do start with this analytic approach that it may require us to perform these distinctions, even if they're artificial. And eventually we come up to a more advanced understanding, a more nuanced understanding, such as the one that takes into account sympathetic parasympathetic balance rather than distinction or unidimensional engagement of one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience?
Is it now that we're going to this nice trattoria for some wine?
Don't mention that. All of a sudden, the virtual shared room of the webinar collapses into pieces because you put your finger in the wound. I mean, there won't be an after talk with drinks and leading to a nice dinner events, because we are all in our own individual digital bubble, unfortunately, of what we heard from Ophelia a couple of seminars ago. Are there any more curiosities, questions, provocations from the audience? If not, I wish to thank you. It has been really interesting. I think your talk beautifully shows how cogent, timely, and hot are the topics we are debating in this series of seminars, really requiring the multiplicity of perspective that also clearly transpired from your approach, the way you framed the issues you were addressing, and also inspiring your empirical approach. This is exactly what we need, and we will learn more in the coming talks in the forthcoming weeks. For the time being, I wish you a great weekend, as great as possible because of the contingencies, and see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you again so much
For the
for your
invitation.
contribution. Bye-bye.
For coming. Ciao, Marcello, Francesca. Ciao.
Bye.